Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Stormer Show today we will be concluding 100 Years of Solitude, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I thank you for joining me for this series. I hope you've enjoyed the story, and if you found it, informative, educational, entertaining, and enjoyed in any way, shape, or form, I encourage you to share it in your circles so that they may also benefit from the knowledge and insight of Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Okay, without further ado, I'll begin with the chapter 19 recap. Then I will dive into chapter 20, which I believe is the ultimate chapter, the final chapter of 100 Years of Solitude. And what a journey it's been. We've seen the circularity of time. We've seen history repeating itself. We've seen some characters receiving the names of other characters. Okay, among other events, political upheaval, love affairs. Yeah, it's been a very eventful book, to say the least. Okay, here we are, chapter 19 recap. This is taken from litcharts.com. Amaranta Ursula returns home from Brussels, leading her husband Gaston on a silk leash. She arrives with loads of luggage, including a cage of 50 canaries and her husband's velocipede. That's an old-fashioned bike, by the way. She wastes no time in trying to fix up the house, getting rid of many of the old family relics, the exception of the daguerreotype of Remedios on the wall. She's vibrant and beautiful and social compared to the solitary young man living in the house. It becomes clear that she intends to remain in Macondo for the rest of her life, despite it being a dead town. That would be her brother, by the way. Her brother, I'm sorry. Her nephew Aureliano, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, her nephew Aureliano. Even a year after her return, having made no friends and thrown no parties, Amaranta Ursula remains convinced she can revive Macondo. Gaston can tell that his wife is lost in a nostalgic memory of the town, rather than the true and present state of it. Cadeli is putting together his bicycle, sure that Amaranta Ursula will awaken from her nostalgia any minute. When she doesn't, he puts the bike together and begins gathering bug specimens to send home to his natural history professor. The couple is passionate about each other, making love wherever and whenever the mood strikes. Gaston's true passion is aviation, and they met when he rode his biplane over the convent where Amaranta Ursula went to school. While Gaston takes to the native food and culture, Amaranta Ursula eats only imported frozen fish and shellfish, canned meats, and continues dressing in the European style. I believe she went to school in Europe. The convent, I believe, was in Europe. They've resolved to wait 5 years to have children. Gaston visits Aureliano and gets the sense that he uses the books he buys at the Catalonian store to verify the knowledge he already innately knows, rather than to teach himself something new. Aureliano is hermetic, though, and unwilling to participate in family life with the couple, so Gaston seeks out a new interest for himself, devising a plan for an airmail service. He had conceived of it prior to his arrival in Macondo, but had envisioned it being put to use in the Belgian Congo, where his family had investments in palm oil. He reconnects with his Belgian partners and prepares the landing field. His partners agree to ship the first airplane and a mechanic. But a year later, the plane still has not arrived. Aureliano wanders Macondo, trying to reconstruct a memory of what the town might have been like at its height. He talks to the remaining residents, and no one can remember the Buendia family, except a single old black man. Particularly strange when you consider how many generations there have been in Macondo. Not only that, but the Buendia family was also the first family in Macondo, the ones who found the town. I mean, Colonel Aureliano Buendia was a folk hero of sorts. The man's granddaughter, Nigromanta, makes them soup, and they continue their friendship even after the old man dies, until Nigromanta warns Aureliano that he's scaring off her customers. Aureliano, still a virgin, feels an attraction to Amaranta Ursula, who he now knows to be his aunt. Even more disturbing. Overcome with the agony of listening to his aunt and Gaston make love, he asks Amaranta Ursula to give him some money and takes it to purchase Nigromanta's services. They become lovers, and Nigromanta dreams of marrying Aureliano, until he tells her he is in love with Amaranta Ursula. After this, Nigromanta requires Aureliano pay for her services to keep her in her ignorant dream. One afternoon at the Catalonian store, Aureliano joins the conversation of four young men discussing methods of killing cockroaches in the Middle Ages. He gathers with these young men each afternoon for the rest of his life. The afternoon of their meeting, the young men go to a brothel, which they continue to frequent together. When Aureliano discusses Colonel Aureliano Buendia, only his friend, Gabriel Marquez, believes him because he knows the man was a close friend of his own great-great-grandfather, Colonel Herrinaldo Marquez. Similarly, when Aureliano brings up the history of the massacre, people deny that even the Banana Company ever existed. The circularity of time, people forgetting what happened before. Lonely, one day, Amaranta Ursula appears in Aureliano's room, wearing a dress and a fish vertebrae necklace she's made. Aureliano tells her about the prophecies and puts his hand on hers. They remain like that until Amaranta Ursula remembers that today is the day to put quicklime on the ants, and she runs off to take care of the task. She continues to visit Aureliano occasionally, and Aureliano begins to have meals with the couple. Gaston's Belgian partners claim the plane was shipped, but the plane never arrives. Gaston mentions the possibility of going to Brussels to clear up the confusion and hasten the arrival of the plane. One afternoon, Amaranta Ursula cuts herself on a can, and Aureliano kisses the wound and reveals his love for her. She calls him a fool and tells him she's leaving for Belgium soon. So, yeah. Gaston's going to Belgium to clear up the confusion. Let's see, where is Brussels? Belgium. Okay, yeah. So, yeah, Gaston's going to Belgium to clear up the confusion about the plane, and Amaranta Ursula is going to either presumably go with Gaston or get away from Aureliano. Or perhaps it's also the case that her nostalgia is fading as Gaston thought would be the case. One of Aureliano's friends tells them about a zoological brothel which they go to visit. Outside the entrance, an old woman exclaims, "Aureliano," thinking she has seen Colonel Aureliano Buendia. It's Pilar Ternera, over 145 years old. Aureliano begins to visit her regularly to hear about the history of Macondo. On the afternoon that Amaranta Ursula rebuffs him, Aureliano runs to the comforts of Pilar Ternera. When he tells her who he's crying over, she laughs at the predictable repetitions of the Buendia family. She assures him that Amaranta Ursula is waiting for him. Back home, Aureliano follows Amaranta Ursula out of the bath. At first, Amaranta Ursula resists, but then she gives in, enjoying herself. Okay, chapter 20. Are they going to have a child with a pig's tail? I could have another episode of this series about the author. It depends on how long this chapter is. If it's not too long, this episode will include the about the author. If this episode runs on for like over an hour or so, then I'll just split the about the author into a separate episode. The real final episode. Okay, anyway, here we go. Pilar Ternera died in her wicker rocking chair during one night of festivities as she watched over the entrance to her paradise. In accordance with her last wishes, she was not buried in a coffin, but sitting in her rocker, which 8 men lowered by ropes into a huge hole dug in the center of the dance floor. Yeah, she lived quite a long life too. Her and Ursula were around for generations. The mulatto girls dressed in black, pale from weeping, invented shadowy rites as they took off their earrings, brooches, and rings and threw them into the pit before it was closed over with a slab that bore neither names nor dates, that was covered with a pile of Amazonian camellias. Yeah, they both also have a pretty big legacy, too. After poisoning the animals, they closed up the doors and windows with brick and mortar. They scattered out into the world with their wooden trunks that were lined with pictures of saints, prints from magazines, the portraits of sometime sweethearts, remote and fantastic, who shat diamonds, or ate cannibals, or were crowned playing card kings on the high seas. It was the end. In Pilar Ternera's tomb, among the psalms and cheap hoard jewelry, the ruins of the past would rot. The little that remained after the wise Catalonian had auctioned off his bookstore and returned to the Mediterranean village where he had been born, overcome by a yearning for a lasting springtime. No one could have foreseen his decision. He arrived in Macondo during the splendor of the Banana Company, fleeing from one of the many wars. Nothing more practical had occurred to him than to set up that bookshop of Incunabula and first editions in several languages. Okay, hang on a second. Early printed books, particularly those before 1501. Which casual customers would thumb through cautiously, as if they were junk books, as they waited their turn to have their dreams interpreted in the house across the way. He spent half his life in the back of the store, scribbling in his extra careful hand in purple ink and on pages that he tore out of school notebooks. No one was sure exactly what he was writing. When Aureliano first met him, he had 2 boxes of those motley pages that in some way made one think of Melchiades parchments. From that time until he left, he had filled a 3rd one, so it was reasonable to believe that he had done nothing else during his stay in Macondo. The only people with whom he maintained relations were the 4 friends, whom he had exchanged their tops and kites for books. He set them to reading Seneca and Ovid while they were still in grammar school. He treated the classical writers with a household familiarity, as if they had all been his roommates at some period. He knew many things that should not have been known, such as the fact that St. Augustine wore a wool jacket under his habit, that he did not take off for 14 years, and that Arnaldo of Villanova, the necromancer, was impotent since childhood because of a scorpion bite. Again, not sting. His fervor for the written word was an interweaving of solemn respect and gospel reverence. Not even his own manuscripts were safe from that dualism. Having learned Catalan in order to translate them, Alfonso put a roll of pages in his pockets, which were always full of newspaper clippings and manuals for strange trades. One night he'd lost them in the house of the little girls who went to bed because of hunger. When the wise old grandfather found out, instead of raising a row as had been feared, he commented, dying with laughter, that it was the natural destiny of literature. On the other hand, there was no human power capable of persuading him not to take along the 3 boxes when he returned to his native village. He unleashed a string of Carthaginian curses at the railroad inspectors, who tried to ship them as freight until he finally succeeded in keeping them with him in the passenger's coach. The world must be all fucked up, he said, then, when men travel first class and literature goes as freight. This was the last thing he was heard to say. He'd spent a dark week on the final preparations for the trip because as the hour approached, his humor was breaking down. Things began to be misplaced. What he put in one place would appear in another, attacked by the same elves that had tormented Fernanda. Colons, he would curse. I shit on Canon 27 of the Synod of London. Yeah, he might be somewhat similar to Aureliano with all of the things that he's read and all the things that he's written. German and Aureliano took care of him, and maybe even the Melchiades. They helped him like a child, fastening his tickets and immigration documents to his pockets with safety pins, making him a detailed list of what he must do from the time he left Macondo until he landed in Barcelona. But nonetheless, he threw away a pair of pants with half his money in it without realizing it. The night before the trip, after nailing up the boxes and putting his clothing into the same suitcase that he had brought when he first came, he narrowed his clam eyes, pointed with a kind of impudent benediction at the stacks of books which he had endured during his exile, and said to his friends, "All that shit there I leave to you people." Three months later, they received in a large envelope 29 letters and more than 50 pictures that he had accumulated during the leisure of the high seas. Although he did not date them, the order in which he had written the letters was obvious. The first ones, with his customary good humor, he spoke about the difficulties of the crossing, the urge he had to throw the cargo officer overboard, when he would not let him keep the 3 boxes in his cabin, the clear imbecility of a lady who was terrified at the number 13, not out of superstition, but because she thought it was a number that had no end. The bet that he had won during the first dinner, because he had recognized in the drinking water on board the taste of the nighttime beats by the springs of Lerida. With the passage of the days, however, the reality of life on board mattered less and less to him. And even the most recent and trivial happenings seemed worthy of nostalgia, because as the ship got farther away, his memory began to grow sad. The process of nostalgia was also evident in the pictures. In the first ones, he looked happy, with his sport shirt, which looked like a hospital jacket, and his snowy mane, in an October Caribbean filled with whitecaps. In the last ones, he could be seen to be wearing a dark coat and a silk scarf, pale in the face, taciturn from absence on the deck of a mournful ship that had come to be like a sleepwalker on the autumnal seas. German and Aureliano answered his letters. He wrote so many during the first months that, at that time, they felt closer to him than when he had been in Macondo. They were almost freed from the rancor that he had left behind. First, he told them that everything was just the same, that the pink snails were still in the house where he had been born, that the dry herrings still had the same taste on a piece of toast, that the waterfalls in the village still took on a perfumed smell at dusk. They were the notebook pages again, woven with the purple scribbling, which he had dedicated a special paragraph to each one. Nevertheless, and although he himself did not seem to notice it, those letters of recuperation and stimulation were slowly changing into pastoral letters of disenchantment. One winter night, while the soup was boiling in the fireplace, he missed the heat of the back of his store, the buzzing of the sun on the dusty almond trees, the whistle of the train during the lethargy of siesta time. Just as in Macondo, he had missed the winter soup in the fireplace, the cries of the coffee vendor, and the fleeting larks of springtime. Upset by two nostalgias facing each other like two mirrors, he lost his marvelous sense of unreality, and he ended up recommending to all of them that they leave Macondo, that they forget everything he had taught them about the world and the human heart, that they shit on Horace, and that wherever they might be, they always remembered that the past was a lie, that memory has no return, that every spring gone by can never be recovered, and that the wildest and most tenacious love was an ephemeral truth in the end. Avero was the first to take the advice to abandon Macondo. He sold everything, even the tame jaguar that teased passers-by from the courtyard of his house. He bought an eternal ticket on a train that never stopped traveling. The postcards that he sent from the way stations, he would describe with shouts the instantaneous images that he had seen from the window of his coach. It was as if he were tearing up and throwing into oblivion some long, evanescent poem. The chimerical Negroes in the cotton fields of Louisiana, the winged horses in the bluegrass of Kentucky, the Greek lovers in the infernal sunsets of Arizona, the girl in the red sweater painting watercolors by a lake in Michigan who waved at him with her brushes, not to say farewell, but out of hope, because she did not know that she was watching a train with no return passing by. Then Alfonso and German left one Saturday with the idea of coming back on Monday, but nothing more was ever heard of them. A year after the departure of the wise Catalonian, the only one left in Macondo was Gabriel, still adrift at the mercy of Negromance's chancy charity, and answering the questions of a contest in a French magazine in which the first prize was a trip to Paris. Aureliano, who was the one who subscribed to it, helped him fill in the answers, sometimes in his house, but most of the time among the ceramic bottles and atmosphere of Valerian in the only pharmacy left in Macondo, where Mercedes, Gabriel's stealthy girlfriend, lived. It was the last that remained of a past whose annihilation had not taken place because it was still in a process of annihilation, consuming itself from within, ending at every moment, but never ending in its ending. The town had reached such extremes of inactivity that when Gabriel won the contest and left for Paris with 2 changes of clothing, a pair of shoes, and a complete work of Rabelais, he had to signal the engineer to stop the train and pick him up. The old street of the Turks was at that time an abandoned corner where the last Arabs were letting themselves be dragged off to death with the age-old custom of sitting in their doorways, although it had been many years since they had sold the last yard of diagonal cloth. In the shadowy showcases, only the decapitated mannequins remained. The Banana Company's city, which Patricia Brown may have tried to evoke for her grandchildren during the nights of intolerance in Dill Pickles in Prattville, Alabama, was a plain of wild grass. The ancient priest who had taken Father Angel's place, and whose name no one had bothered to find out, waited God's mercy stretched out casually in a hammock, tortured by arthritis and the insomnia of doubt, while the lizards and rats fought over the inheritance of the nearby church. In that Macondo forgotten, even by the birds, where the dust and the heat had become so strong that it was difficult to breathe, secluded by solitude and love, and by the solitude of love in a house where it was almost impossible to sleep because of the noise of the red ants. Aureliano and Amaranta Ursula were the only happy beings, the most happy on the face of the earth. Gaston had returned to Brussels. Tired of waiting for the airplane, one day he put his indispensable things into a small suitcase, took his file of correspondence, left with the idea of returning by air before his concession was turned over to a group of German pilots who had presented the provincial authorities with a more ambitious project than his. Since the afternoon of their first love, Aureliano Amaranta Ursula had continued taking advantage of her husband's rare unguarded moments, making love with gagged ardor in chance meetings, and almost always interrupted by unexpected returns. When they saw themselves alone in the house, they succumbed to the delirium of lovers who were making up for a lost time. It was a mad passion, unhinging, which made Fernanda's bones tremble with horror in her grave, which kept them in a state of perpetual excitement. Amaranta Ursula's shrieks, her songs of agony, would break out the same at 2 in the afternoon on the dining room table as at 2 in the morning in the pantry. What hurts me most, she would say, laughing, is all the time that we wasted. If she's gonna give birth to a kid with the pigtail, I'm gonna be like, wow, Gabriel, wow, just wow. Okay, in the bewilderment of passion, she watched the ants devastate in the garden, sating their prehistoric hunger with the beams of the house. She watched the torrents of living lava take over the porch again. She bothered to fight them only when she found them in her bedroom. Aureliano abandoned the parchments, did not leave the house again, and carelessly answered the letters from the wise Catalonian. They lost their sense of reality, the notion of time, the rhythm of daily habits. They closed the doors and windows again so as to not waste time getting undressed, and they walked about the house as Remedios the Beauty had wanted to do. They would roll around naked in the mud of the courtyard. One afternoon they almost drowned as they made love in the cistern. In a short time they did more damage than the red ants. They destroyed the furniture in their parlor. In their madness they tore to shreds the hammock that had resisted the sad bivouac gloves of Colonel Aureliano Buendia. They disemboweled the mattresses and emptied them on the floor as they suffocated in storms of cotton. Although Aureliano was just as ferocious a lover as his rival, it was Amaranta Ursula who ruled in that paradise of disaster with her mad genius and her lyrical veracity, as if she had concentrated in her love the unconquerable energy that her great-great-grandmother had given to the making of little candy animals. Yet while she was singing with pleasure and dying with laughter over her own inventions, Aureliano was becoming more and more absorbed and silent, for his passion was self-centered and burning. Nevertheless, they both reached such extremes of virtuosity that when they became exhausted from excitement, they take advantage of their fatigue. Yeah, and I'm going to blame this crime against nature on Amaranta Ursula. What's the matter with you, woman? They give themselves over to the worship of their bodies, discovering that the rest periods in love had unexplored possibilities much richer than those of desire. While he would rub Amaranta Ursula's erect breasts with egg whites or smooth her elastic thighs and peach-like stomach with cocoa butter, she would play with Aureliano's pretentious creature as if it were a doll, and would paint clown's eyes on it with her lipstick and give it a Turk's mustache with her eyebrow pencil. Would put on organza bow ties and little tinfoil hats. Okay. Okay. Again, wow, Gabriel. One night they daubed themselves from head to toe with peach jam, licked each other like dogs, and made love on the floor of the porch. They were wakened by a torrent of carnivorous ants who were ready to eat them alive. During the pauses in their delirium, Amaranta Ursula would answer Gaston's letters. She felt him to be so far away and busy that his return seemed impossible to her. One of his first letters, he told her that his partners had actually sent the airplane, but that a shipping agent in Brussels had sent it by mistake to Tanganyika, where it was delivered to the scattered tribe of the Makondos. The mix-up brought on so many difficulties that just to get the plane back might take 2 years, so Amaranta Ursula dismissed the possibility of an inopportune return. Aureliano, for his part, had no other contact with the world except for the letters from the wise Catalonian and the news he had of Gabriel through Mercedes, the silent pharmacist. At first they were real contacts. Gabriel had turned in his return ticket in order to stay in Paris, selling the old newspaper and empty bottles that the chambermaid threw out of a gloomy hotel on the Rue Dauphine. Aureliano could visualize him then, in a turtleneck sweater which he took off only when the sidewalk cafes of Montparnasse filled with springtime lovers, sleeping by day, writing by night in order to confuse hunger in the room that smelled of boiled cauliflower where Commodore was to die. Nevertheless, news about him was slowly becoming so uncertain, the letters from the wise man so sporadic and melancholy, that Aureliano grew to think about them as Amaranta Ursula thought about her husband. Both of them remained floating in an empty universe where the only everyday and eternal reality was love. Disturbing is all you get. What a disturbing ending to a book. Suddenly, like a stampede in that world of happy unawareness, came the news of Gaston's return. Aureliano and Amaranta Ursula opened their eyes, dug deep into their souls, looked at the letter with their hands on their hearts, and understood that they were so close to each other that they preferred death to separation. And she wrote her husband a letter of contradictory truths in which she repeated her love and said how anxious she was to see him again. But at the same time, she admitted as a design of fate the impossibility of living without Aureliano. Contrary to what they had expected, Gaston sent them a calm, almost paternal reply, with 2 whole pages devoted to a warning against the fickleness of passion, and a final paragraph with unmistakable wishes for them to be as happy as he had been during his brief conjugal experience. It was such an unforeseen attitude that Amaranta Ursula felt humiliated by the idea that she had given her husband the pretext that he had wanted in order to abandon her to her fate. The rancor was aggravated 6 months later when Gaston wrote again from Leopoldville, where he had finally recovered the airplane, simply to ask them to ship him the Velocipede, which of all that he had left behind in Macondo was the only thing that had any sentimental value for him. Aureliano bore Amaranta Ursula's spite patiently, made an effort to show her that he could be as good a husband in adversity as in prosperity. Daily needs that besieged them when Gaston's last money ran out created a bond of solidarity between them that was not as dazzling and heady as passion, but that let them make love as much and be as happy as during their uproarious and salacious days. At the time Pilar Turner died, they were expecting a child. Again. In the lethargy of her pregnancy, Amaranta Ursula tried to set up a business, necklaces made out of the backbones of fish. Except for Mercedes, who bought a dozen, she could not find any customers. Aureliano was aware for the first time that his gift for languages, his encyclopedic knowledge, his rare faculty for remembering the details of remote deeds and places without having been there, were as useless as the box of genuine jewelry that his wife owned, which must have been worth as much as all the money that the last inhabitants of Macondo could have put together. They survived miraculously. Although Amaranta Ursula did not lose her good humor or her genius for erotic mischief, she acquired the habit of sitting on the porch after lunch in a kind of wakeful and thoughtful siesta. Aureliano would accompany her. Sometimes they would remain there. This book is extremely messed up, in some ways. Sometimes they would remain there in silence until nightfall, opposite each other, looking into each other's eyes, loving each other as much as in their scandalous days. The uncertainty of the future made them turn their hearts toward the past. They saw themselves in the lost paradise of the deluge, splashing in the puddles in the courtyard, killing lizards to hang on Ursula, pretending that they were going to bury her alive. Those memories revealed to them the truth that they had been happy together ever since they had memory. Was that them who were messing with Ursula when they were kids? I guess so, right? Yeah, and I remember saying, why isn't Fernanda doing anything about this? She's had her head up her butt the entire time. Yeah, I guess so. I guess so. Guess it was them. Going deeper into the past, Amaranta Ursula remembered the afternoon on which she had gone into the silver shop, and her mother told her that little Aureliano was nobody's child because he'd been found floating in a basket. He is actually her sister's child, Meme. Again, a lot of this is because of Amaranta Ursula, and a lot of this is from Fernanda. Like, Fernanda just was a place to store problems, like a person to store problems in, until she died. Anyway, it's like all the good that Ursula was trying to do, like Fernanda was undoing it. Almost in like, I don't even know, like just reckless, complete reckless fashion. Okay, let me continue. Although the version seemed unlikely to them, they did not have any information enabling them to replace it with the true one. All that they were sure of after examining all the possibilities was that Fernanda was not Aureliano's mother. True. Fernanda would be his grandmother. Amaranta Ursula was inclined to believe that he was the son of Pedro Cortez, of whom she remembered only tales of infamy. That supposition produced a twinge of horror in her heart. Let's see. Pedro Cortez is the lover. It's hard to remember at this point. The lover of Aureliano Segundo. Yes. The lover of Aureliano Segundo, who is himself married to Fernanda. It's almost no wonder. Like, yeah, and they never actually had kids, so yeah, not quite. Tormented by the certainty that he was his wife's brother, Aureliano ran out to the parish house. Okay, wait. Yeah, so she is the child of Fernanda and Aureliano Segundo. So yeah, they couldn't be brother and sister. They would only be brother and sister if they were both the daughters of Pedro Cortez. And the reality is, neither one of them are. As I've said before, a confused lineage. Like, people are forgetting like who they are, who people in the family are. It's like, who am I? Who are you? What does any of this mean? We're losing our minds in Macondo. I guess so. If you can't even remember who your cousin is, I guess you are losing your mind. Like, who your cousin or nephew is, like, yeah, you're already losing your mind. I guess in this case it would be sister or nephew. Mom, sister, or nephew. Like, you're forgetting who your mom is. Okay. Aureliano ran out to the parish house to search, and he's getting upset for the wrong reason. It's not wrong because you're her brother. It's wrong because she's your aunt. And actually, I think he knew that from the previous chapter. Like, he knew that in the previous chapter, so I think he forgot it. He forgot it in between the last chapter and this chapter, what his relationship to his aunt was. Aureliano ran out to the parish house to search through the moldy and moth-eaten archives for some clue to his parentage. The oldest baptismal certificate that he found was that of Amaranta Buendia, baptized in adolescence by Father Nicanor Reina during the time when he was trying to prove the existence of God by means of tricks with chocolate. That would have been the original Amaranta, I believe. Was there really no record kept of Meme's birth? I guess not. We began to have that feeling that he was one of the 17 Aurelianos, whose birth certificates he tracked down as he went through 4 volumes. But the baptism dates were too far back for his age. Yes, you're not. You're not any of the. You may have the same name as all of those Aurelianos, but you're not the same person as them. Another problem with naming all of your kids after yourself. It results in mass confusion. Seeing him lost in the labyrinths of kinship, trembling with uncertainty, the arthritic priest, who was watching him from his hammock, asked him compassionately what his name was. Aureliano Buendia, he said. Then don't wear yourself out searching, the priest exclaimed with final conviction. Many years ago, there used to be a street here with that name, and in those days, people had the custom of naming their children after streets. Aureliano trembled with rage. That must have been Colonel Aureliano Buendia. So, he said, you don't believe it either. Believe what? That Colonel Aureliano Buendia fought 32 civil wars and lost them all, Aureliano answered. That the army hemmed in and machine gunned 3,000 workers, and that their bodies were carried off to be thrown into the sea on a train with 200 cars. The priest measured him with a pitying look. Oh, my son, he sighed. It's enough for me to be sure that you and I exist at this moment. So Aureliano and Amaranta Ursula accepted the version of the basket, not because they believed it, but because it spared them their terror. Yes, you are Meme's son. Fernanda. As the pregnancy advances, they're becoming a single being. They're becoming more and more integrated in the solitude of a house that needed only one last breath to be knocked down. They restricted themselves to an essential area from Fernanda's bedroom, where the charms of sedentary love were visible, to the beginning of the porch, where Amaranta Ursula would sit to sew booties and bonnets for the newborn baby. And Aureliano would answer the occasional letters from the wise Catalonian. The rest of the house was given over to the tenacious assault of destruction. The silver shop, Milcade's room, the primitive and silent realm of Santa Sofia de la Piedad remained in the depths of a domestic jungle that no one would have had the courage to penetrate. Surrounded by the voracity of nature, Aureliano and Amaranta Ursula continued cultivating the oregano and the begonias and defended their world with demarcations of quicklime, building the last trenches in the age-old war between man and ant. Her long and neglected hair, the splotches that were beginning to appear on her face, the swelling of her legs, the deformation of her former love-making weasel's body, had changed Amaranta Ursula from the youthful creature she had been when she arrived at the house with a cage of luckless canaries and her captive husband, but it did not change the vivacity of her spirit. It's almost funny and ironic in a way that she shows up to Macondo with her husband, Gaston, on a silk leash, and yet she's the one who cannot remain faithful because she'd rather cheat with her nephew. Yeah. I think that's kind of funny, frankly. Funny and disturbing. Anyway. Yeah, she is continuing the legacy of Amaranthus by acting selfishly and recklessly in love. It had been mailed in Barcelona, but the envelope was addressed in conventional blue ink by an official hand, and it had the innocent and impersonal look of hostile messages. Aureliano snatched it out of Amaranta Ursula's hands as she was about to open it. Not this one, he told her. I don't want to know what it says. Just as he had sensed, the wise Catalonian did not write again. The stranger's letter, which no one read, was left to the mercy of the moths on the shelf where Fernanda had forgotten her wedding ring. On occasion, and there remained, consuming itself in the inner fire of its bad news as the solitary lovers sailed against the tide of those days of the last stages, those impenitent and ill-fated times which were squandered on the useless effort of making them drift toward the desert of disenchantment and oblivion. Who went to Barcelona? Was it Alvaro? Alvaro was on the train. Even I'm forgetting. There have been so many characters who've come and gone that even at this point in time, I'm like, one of your friends, Aureliano, who left town. And Gabriel himself just writes this stranger's letter. It's like, apparently it's not that important what it said, who it was from. Something about bad news. Aware of that menace, Aureliano and Amaranta Ursula spent the last months holding hands, ending with the love of loyalty for the child who had his beginning in the madness of fornication. At night, holding each other in bed, they were not frightened by the sublunary explosions of the ants, or the noise of the moths, or the constant and clean whistle of the growth of weeds in the neighboring rooms. Many times they were awakened by the traffic of the dead. They could hear Ursula fighting against the laws of creation to maintain the line. Jose Arcadio Buendia, searching for the mythical truth of the great inventions. Fernanda praying. Colonel Aureliano Buendia, stupefying himself with the deception of war and the little goldfishes. Aureliano Segundo, dying of solitude in the turmoil of his debauches. When they learned that dominant obsessions can prevail against death, they were happy again with the certainty that they would go on loving each other in their shape as apparitions, long after their other species of future animals would steal from the insects the paradise of misery that the insects were finally stealing from man. On Sunday at 6 in the afternoon, Amaranta Ursula felt the pangs of childbirth. The smelling mistress of little girls who went to bed because of hunger had her get onto the dining room table, straddled her stomach, and mistreated her with wild gallops until her cries were drowned out by the bellows of a formidable male child. Through her tears, Amaranta Ursula could see that he was one of those great Buendias, strong and willful like the Jose Arcadios, the open and clairvoyant eyes of the Aurelianos. Yeah, that was all. And predisposed to begin the race again from the beginning and cleanse it of its pernicious vices and solitary calling, for he was the only one in a century who had been engendered with love. Yeah, the original was Jose Arcadio Buendia, right? Yes. So there was not an Aureliano until Colonel Aureliano Buendia. He's a real cannibal, she said. We'll name him Rodrigo. No, her husband countered. We'll name him Aureliano, and he'll win 32 wars. Yes, because why would you name your son anything other than your name? That would require creativity. That would require an ability to form a new idea. After cutting the umbilical cord, the midwife began to use a cloth to take off the blue grease that covered his body as Aureliano held up a lamp. Only when they turned, and by the way, this is like the what? Like we can count it out. This is like the 36th or 37th Aureliano in the book. Okay, I'll count it. I'll count it out after I'm done with this chapter. Only when they turned him on his stomach did they see that he had something more than other men. They leaned over to examine him. It was the tail of a pig. Where is Ursula when you need her? And she was warning about it from the get-go. Ay. You had to know that this is how Gabriel was going to end this book. You just had to know it. They were not alarmed. Aureliano and Amaranta Ursula were not aware of the family precedent, nor did they remember Ursula's frightening admonitions. The midwife pacified them with the idea that the tail could be cut off when the child got his second teeth. Then they had no time to think about it again because Amaranta Ursula was bleeding in an uncontainable torrent. They tried to help her with applications of spiderwebs and balls of ash. It was like trying to hold back a spring with one's hands. During the first hour, she tried to maintain her good humor. She took the friend Aureliano by the hand and begged him not to worry, because people like her were not made to die against their will. She exploded with laughter at the ferocious remedies of the midwife. But as Aureliano's hope abandoned him, she was becoming less visible as the light on her was fading away, till she sank into drowsiness. At dawn on Monday, they brought a woman who recited cauterizing prayers that were infallible for man and beast beside her bed. But Amaranta Ursula's passionate blood was insensible to any artifice that did not come from love. The afternoon, after 24 hours of desperation, they knew that she was dead because the flow had stopped without remedies and her profile became sharp. The blotches on her face evaporated in a halo of alabaster, and she smiled again. Never before have I been so relieved for a character to be dead in this book. Like, Amaranta Ursula is probably the most annoying character that's been in the book yet. Like, I'm like, good, thank goodness she's gone. Other than maybe Fernanda, who is also like just a troubled character from the get-go. Aureliano did not understand until then how much he loved his friends, how much he missed them, how much he would have given to be with them at that moment. He put the child in the basket that his mother had prepared for him, covered the face of the corpse with a blanket, wandered aimlessly through the town, searching for an entrance that went back to the past. He knocked at the door of the pharmacy, where he had not visited lately, and he found a carpenter shop. The old woman who opened the door with a lamp in her hand took pity on his delirium and insisted that no, there had never been a pharmacy there, nor had she ever known a woman with a thin neck and sleepy eyes named Mercedes. He wept, leaning his brow against the door of the wise Catalonian's former bookstore, conscious that he was paying with his tardy sobs for death, a death that he had refused to weep for on time, so as to not break the spell of love. He smashed his fist against the cement wall of the Golden Child, calling for Pilar Ternera, indifferent to the luminous orange discs that were crossing the sky, and that so many times on holiday nights he had contemplated with childish fascination from the courtyard of the Curlews. In the last open salon of the tumble-down red-light district, an accordion group was playing the songs of Rafael Escalona, the bishop's nephew, heir to the secrets of Francisco the Man. The bartender, who had a withered and somewhat crumpled arm because he raised it against his mother, invited Aureliano to have a bottle of cane liquor. Aureliano then bought him one. The bartender spoke to him about the misfortune of his arm. Aureliano spoke to him about the misfortune of his heart, withered and somewhat crumpled for having been raised against his sister. They ended up weeping together, and Aureliano felt for a moment that the pain was over. When he was alone again in the last dawn of Macondo, he opened up his arms in the middle of the square, ready to wake up the whole world, and he shouted with all his might, "Friends are a bunch of bastards." Kind of funny that he's saying that, considering the life he's led. But okay. Eager Manta rescued him from a pool of vomit and tears. He took him to her room, cleaned him up, made him drink a cup of broth. Yeah, practically every mistake that he's made has been his own, too. It's like you were going fine until you started having this bizarre love obsession with your aunt. Like, you were doing so well, then that happened. Thinking that would console him, she took a piece of charcoal and erased the innumerable loves that he still owed her for. She voluntarily brought up her own most solitary sadnesses, so as to not leave him alone in his weeping. When he awoke after a dull and brief sleep, Aureliano recovered the awareness of his headache. He opened his eyes and remembered the child. He could not find the basket. At first, he felt an outburst of joy, thinking that Amaranta Ursula had awakened from death to take care of the child. But her corpse was a pile of stones under the blanket. Aware that when he arrived, he found the door to the bedroom open, Aureliano went across the porch, which was saturated with the morning sighs of oregano, looked into the dining room, where the remnants of the birth still lay, the large pot, the bloody sheets, the jars of ashes, and the twisted umbilical cord of the child on an open diaper on the table next to the shears and the fish line. The idea that the midwife had returned for the child during the night gave him a pause of rest in which to think. He sank into the rocking chair, the same one in which Rebecca had sat during the earlier days of the house to give embroidery lessons, which Amaranta had played Chinese checkers with Colonel Herrinaldo Marquez, and in which Amaranta Ursula had sewn the tiny clothing for the child. And in that flash of lucidity, he became aware that he was unable to bear in his soul the crushing weight of so much past. Wounded by the fatal lances of his own nostalgia and that of others, he admired the persistence of the spiderwebs on the dead rose bushes, the perseverance of the ryegrass, the patience of the air in the radiant February dawn. Then he saw the child. It was just a dry and bloated bag of skin that all the ants in the world were dragging toward their holes along the stone path in the garden. Aureliano could not move, not because he was paralyzed by horror, but because all at that prodigious instant, Melchiad's final keys were revealed to him, and he saw the epigraph of the parchments perfectly placed in the order of man's time and space. The first of the line is tied to a tree, and the last is being eaten by ants. Aureliano had never been more lucid in any act of his life, as when he forgot about his dead ones and the pain of his dead ones, and nailed up the doors and windows again with Fernandez crossed boards, so as to not be disturbed by any temptations of the world, for he knew that his fate was written in Melchiad's parchments. He found them intact among the prehistoric plants, steaming puddles, and luminous insects, that he had removed all trace of man's passage on earth from the room. He did not have the calmness to bring them out into the light, but right there, standing without the slightest difficulty, as they had been written in Spanish, or being read under the dazzling splendor of high noon, he began to decipher them aloud. It was the history of the family, written by Melchiades, down to the most trivial details, 100 years ahead of time. He had written it in Sanskrit, which was his mother tongue, and he had encoded the even lines in the private cipher of the Emperor Augustus and the odd ones in the Lacedaemonian military code. The final protection, which Aureliano had begun to glimpse then he let himself be confused by the love of Amaranta Ursula, was based on the fact that Melchiades had not put events in the order of man's conventional time, but had concentrated a century of daily episodes in such a way that they coexisted in one instant. Fascinated by the discovery, Aureliano read aloud without skipping the chanted encyclicals that Melchiades himself had made Arcadia listen to, and were in reality the prediction of his execution. He found the announcement of the birth of the most beautiful woman in the world, who was rising up to heaven in body and soul. And he found the origin of the posthumous twins, who gave up deciphering the parchments, not simply through incapacity and lack of drive, but also because their attempts were premature. Maybe Jose Arcadio Segundo could have, but I doubt it. At that point, impatient to know his own origin, Aureliano skipped ahead. Meme is your mom. Meme and Mauricio Babylonia are your parents. The wind began warm, incipient, full of voices from the past, the murmurs of ancient geraniums, sighs of disenchantment that preceded the most tenacious nostalgia. He did not notice it because at that moment he was discovering the first indications of his own being in a lascivious grandfather who let himself be frivolously dragged along across a hallucinated plateau in search of a beautiful woman who would not make him happy. Aureliano recognized him. He pursued the hidden paths of his descent, found the instant of his own conception among the scorpions and the yellow butterflies in a sunset bathroom where a mechanic satisfied his lust on a woman who was giving herself out of rebellion. He was so absorbed that he did not feel the second surge of wind either, as its cyclonic strength tore the doors and windows off their hinges, pulled off the roof of the east wing, and uprooted the foundations. Only then did he discover that Amaranta Ursula was not his sister, but his aunt, that Sir Francis Drake had attacked Riohacha only so that they could seek each other through the most intricate labyrinths of blood, until they would engender the mythological animal that was to bring the line to an end. Wakanda was already a fearful whirlwind of dust and rubble being spun about by the wrath of the biblical hurricane. When Aureliano skipped 11 pages so as to not lose time with facts he knew only too well. He began to decipher the instant that he was living, deciphering it as he lived it, prophesying himself in the act of deciphering the last page of the parchments, as if he were looking into a speaking mirror. Then he skipped again to anticipate the predictions and ascertain the date and circumstances of his death. Before reaching the final line, however, he'd already understood that he would never leave that room, for it was foreseen that the city of mirrors, or mirages, would be wiped out by the wind and exiled from memory of men at the precise moment when Aureliano of Babylonia would finish deciphering the parchments, that everything written on them was unrepeatable since time immemorial and forevermore, because races condemned to 100 years of solitude did not have a second opportunity on earth. That's the end of the book. Wow. Gotta hand it to him, man. It was a great book. Okay, let me take a look at the PS. There's about the author, about the book, and read on. I think I'll save that one for a final special episode for those of you in the audience that might be interested in reading or hearing me read about the author of the book and more to read. It's about, I think, 15 or 16 pages about. So that'll be next time as the post-book content. But I hope you all enjoyed the book, 100 Years of Solitude. What a journey, what an adventure. I'll probably have reviews up on my media, but I really enjoyed the book. Just very well written. Gabriel Garcia Marquez's prose is reflective of a high level of intellectual ability. Like, he had just a very expansive vocabulary, and that's conveyed in his word usage. It's conveyed through various chapters, how they're written. I think is very reflective of his writing ability. But yeah, thank you all for watching. Hope you've enjoyed this book series and this book. And thanks again for watching.